August 22nd, 1944. 18,000 feet above Hankow, China. Captain Robert Peterson of the 23rd Fighter Group scanned the sky through his P-51 Mustang's bubble canopy, leading his flight on another routine patrol over Japanese-held territory. The Americans had been dominating these skies for months now with their new Mustangs, relegating the Japanese to defensive operations. Below, the Yangtze River snaked through the hazy Chinese landscape. Peterson's radio crackled with the usual chatter. Then something appeared on the horizon, a formation of Japanese fighters climbing aggressively toward them. Peterson smiled. Another chance to add to his score? The Japanese had been flying the same outdated machines for years, Oscars mostly, the nimble but lightly armed Ki-84 Hayabusa that American pilots had learned to respect for their maneuverability, but ultimately learned to defeat with superior speed and firepower. These looked like Oscars from a distance. Same profile, same general shape. Peterson rolled his Mustang into an attack dive, his wingmen following. This should be quick. But as the range closed, something felt wrong. These aircraft were climbing faster than any Oscar Peterson had ever seen. They were keeping pace with his diving Mustangs, an impossibility for the underpowered Japanese fighters he knew. Then the first burst of cannon fire tore past his canopy, far more concentrated than Oscar's rifle-caliber machine guns. Peterson broke hard left, his Mustang protesting at the sudden G-load. The Japanese fighter that had just fired at him flashed past, and in that brief instant, Peterson saw it clearly. This was no Oscar. It was heavier, more purposeful looking, with a massive radial engine and what appeared to be cannon barrels protruding from the wings, and it was turning back toward him, with a speed and authority that made his blood run cold. What Peterson and his fellow pilots didn't know, what American intelligence hadn't yet fully grasped, was that they had just encountered the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, codenamed Frank by Allied intelligence, and everything they thought they knew about Japanese fighters was about to be rewritten. The story of the Frank begins not with its first flight or combat debut, but with a moment of brutal honesty within the Japanese military establishment. By late 1941, as Japan prepared for war with the Western powers, the Army Air Service conducted a sobering assessment of its fighter inventory. The Ki-84 Hayabusa, entering service that year, was a masterpiece of maneuverability. It could outturn anything in the sky, but it was also fragile, lightly armed, and painfully slow at altitude. The Ki-84 Shoki, faster and more heavily armed, sacrificed the maneuverability that Japanese pilots prized. On December 29, 1941, just weeks after Pearl Harbor, the Army Air Service issued an ambitious specification. They wanted a fighter that combined the agility of the Ki-83 with the performance of the Ki-84, while matching the speed and firepower of the best Western fighters. To anyone familiar with aircraft design, this seemed impossible. Maneuverability and high-speed performance were traditionally opposing characteristics. You could build a light, nimble fighter, or a heavy, fast one, but not both. The specification called for a top speed between 398 and 423 miles per hour, a service ceiling exceeding 32,000 feet, an operational endurance of 90 minutes at combat power, 250 miles from base. The armament requirement was unprecedented for Japanese standards. Two 12.7mm machine guns and two 20mm cannon, plus armor protection for the pilot and self-sealing fuel tanks. These last requirements represented a philosophical shift. For years, Japanese fighter doctrine had prioritized offensive capability over pilot protection, reasoning that a dead enemy pilot was worth more than a protected friendly one. But combat experience in China and early Pacific battles was teaching harsh lessons. American and British pilots could survive hits that would kill Japanese airmen. Their aircraft, built with redundant systems and protective armor, could absorb damage and return home. Japanese fighters, built like racing planes, were death traps once hit. Nakajima Aircraft Company assigned the project to designer Koyama Taichi, a 32-year-old engineer who had worked on several previous fighters. Koyama understood that meeting the specification would require a radical departure from Japanese design philosophy. He would need a powerful engine, something Japanese industry struggled to produce. He would need robust construction, anathema to weight-conscious Japanese designers, and he would need to somehow maintain the maneuverability that army pilots demanded. The key would be the engine. Nakajima's own design, the He-45 Homai, meaning praise or honor, was an 18-cylinder air-cooled radial producing 2,000 horsepower. On paper, it was competitive with American engines like the Pratt & Whitney WWII that powered the Hellcat and Thunderbolt. In reality, it was an engineering nightmare. The HIMAR achieved its power through extremely high compression ratios and tight tolerances, pushing Japanese metallurgy to its limits. It required skilled maintenance, high-octane fuel, and precision manufacturing. All of these would be in increasingly short supply as the war progressed. But in early 1942, with Japanese forces triumphant across the Pacific, these concerns seemed manageable. Koyama's design took shape quickly. The Ki-84 would be a compact fighter built around the powerful HIMAR engine. Its all-metal construction with fabric-covered control surfaces represented robust engineering compared to previous Japanese fighters. The wing loading would be higher than the Ki-43, trading some low-speed maneuverability for better high-speed handling. But careful attention to aerodynamics and control surface design would preserve enough agility to satisfy Army pilots. The prototype took shape at Nakajima's Ota factory through late 1942 and early 1943. When it first flew in March 1943, test pilots immediately recognized they had something special. Lieutenant Funabashi, conducting early test flights at Tachikawa in summer 1943, pushed the second prototype to 387 miles per hour in level flight. This matched the performance of American fighters then entering service. More impressively, the aircraft climbed to 16,400 feet in less than 6 minutes, and when Funabashi put it through aerobatic maneuvers, the Ki-84 responded with an agility that belied its weight. It wasn't as nimble as the Ki-43, but it was far more maneuverable than its American counterparts. The testing program revealed few serious problems, a rarity in aircraft development. Some modifications were needed. The fin and rudder area was increased to improve control during takeoff. Fuselage changes eased production, but fundamentally, the design was sound. By August 1943, the first service trial batch of 83 aircraft began rolling off the production line. The Japanese Army Air Service accepted the aircraft for production as the Army Type 4 Fighter Model 1A Hayate. The Allied code name would come later, assigned by Colonel Frank McCoy of the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit after captured examples were examined. He named it after himself, Frank. An experimental training company began working with the new fighter in October 1943, refining tactics and identifying any remaining problems. The unit operated from bases in Japan, putting the Hayate through its paces under operational conditions. Pilots transitioning from the docile Kasuotoshi had to adjust to the Frank's more aggressive ground handling. It was faster on landing, required more runway, and demanded more attention during takeoff. But once airborne, pilots fell in love with it. The power was intoxicating. The Frank accelerated like nothing they had flown before. In a dive, it built speed with frightening enthusiasm. And unlike the Ki-43, which felt fragile and required gentle handling, the Frank was robust. You could throw it around the sky with confidence. In March 1944, the experimental company was disbanded. Its pilots and aircraft were assigned to the 22nd Sentai, an experienced combat unit being reformed for a special mission. The regiment's commander, Major Jozo Iwahashi, was a 12-year veteran with 20 confirmed victories dating back to the undeclared war against the Soviet Union at Nomonhan in 1939. He was exactly the kind of aggressive, experienced leader the Army wanted introducing their best new fighter to combat. The 22nd Sentai received 40 Ki-84s in March and April 1944. The pilots, drawn from veterans across the Army Air Service, underwent intensive training. They learned the Frank's characteristics, its strengths and limitations. At low altitude, it was fast and powerful. At medium altitudes between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, it outperformed every Japanese fighter in service. Its climb rate was exceptional. Its armament was devastating compared to previous Japanese fighters. The two nose-mounted 12.7mm machine guns, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, were supplemented by two wing-mounted 20mm 005 cannon. Each cannon carried 150 rounds, enough for sustained fire. The machine guns had 350 rounds each. This was firepower the Japanese had never before mounted on an army fighter. The pilots also learned the Frank's limitations. The HIMAR engine was temperamental. It required precise maintenance and good fuel. The landing gear, inadequately heat-treated due to material shortages, was prone to failure. and at very high altitudes above 30,000 feet, the Franks' performance dropped off compared to American fighters specifically designed for stratospheric combat. But between 5,000 and 25,000 feet, the altitude band where most Pacific air combat occurred, the Frank was formidable. In August 1944, the 22nd Sentai deployed to Hankow, China. Their mission was to counter the American 14th Air Force, General Claire Chennault's command that had been operating with relative impunity over Chinese skies. The Americans were flying P-40Ns, P-51 Mustangs, and P-47 Thunderbolts. Modern, powerful fighters flown by increasingly confident pilots who had grown accustomed to Japanese aircraft being easy prey. On August 22, 1944, the 22nd Sentai flew its first combat mission. Major Iwahashi led a formation toward reported American fighters near Hankow. The encounter opened the way it would for many American pilots over the next weeks. They saw what they thought were Oscars and attacked confidently. Then, everything went wrong. The fight that developed shocked the Americans. These Japanese fighters climbed with them, an impossibility for Oscars. They maintained speed in maneuvers, and their firepower was devastating. The 20mm cannon hits didn't just damage aircraft, they tore pieces off. First Lieutenant Robert Peterson, who had initiated the engagement so confidently, found himself in the fight of his life. The Frank pilot on his tail stayed with him through violent evasive maneuvers. Peterson's Mustang had a speed advantage, but only at altitude. Down low, where the fight had descended, the Frank was nearly as fast and far more agile. Peterson survived by using his speed to disengage, diving away and staying in the dive until he'd opened enough distance. His wingman wasn't as fortunate. The mission report made sobering reading. The 23rd Fighter Group claimed 2 enemy aircraft destroyed, but admitted losing 1 P-51 with 2 more damaged so severely they barely made it home. More concerning were the pilot accounts. These weren't Oscars. These were something new and dangerous. Over the next 5 weeks, the 22nd Sentai conducted a campaign that stunned American and Chinese forces. Flying from Hankow, they struck airfields, intercepted bomber formations, and engaged American fighters with aggressive confidence. The Americans had numbers and logistics on their side. But the 22nd Sentai had the Frank and, crucially, some of Japan's best remaining pilots. August gave way to September, and the stories multiplied. American pilots reported enemy fighters that could climb with Mustangs, turn inside Thunderbolts, and absorb punishment that would have destroyed earlier Japanese aircraft. The Frank's radial engine, lacking vulnerable coolant systems, could take hits that would have doomed the liquid-cooled engines in American and British fighters. On September 8, 1944, Boeing B-29 Superfortresses of the 20th Air Force struck the Showa Steel Works at Anshan in Manchuria. 90 bombers dropped 206 tons of ordnance on the target. The 22nd Sentai intercepted. Major Iwahashi led his Franks into the bomber stream at 25,000 feet. The B-29 gunners opened fire, their 50 caliber machine guns creating a wall of lead. But the Franks pressed through. 1 Superfortress went down during the raid. 4 others were damaged. 2 were forced to land in China, and Japanese fighters strafed one on the ground. The Superfortress gunners claimed 8 enemy fighters destroyed, almost certainly an exaggeration. But the raid had been costly, and the defenders were using a fighter the Americans hadn't encountered in numbers before. Intelligence reports began circulating. A new Japanese army fighter, probably a development of the Oscar or Tojo, was operational in China. It was faster, more heavily armed, and more dangerous than previous types. Captured examples were desperately needed for evaluation. On September 21, 1944, Major Iwahashi led a strike against Xi'an Airfield. The mission went badly. Iwahashi's Frank was hit by ground fire during a strafing run. According to witnesses on both sides, the Japanese commander, realizing he couldn't make it back, deliberately dove his burning fighter into the ground. Some said he was trying to crash into an American fighter parked on the field. Whether suicide attack or loss of control, Iwahashi was dead. His loss was significant. He had been the 22nd Sentai's heart and soul, an aggressive leader who inspired his pilots. But the unit continued operations under new command. By early October 1944, American pilots in China had grudging respect for the new Japanese fighter. Some were calling it the best they'd faced. Charles Older, deputy commander of the 23rd Fighter Group and a veteran of the Flying Tigers, managed to shoot down 4 Franks in a single engagement in September. but his own account given years later emphasized how dangerous they were. He'd caught them by surprise shortly after takeoff, getting them at a disadvantage. In any remotely fair fight, the Frank was deadly. The 22nd Sentai's rampage ended in October 1944 when they received orders to redeploy. American forces were invading the Philippines. Every available Japanese unit was being rushed to counter the threat. The 22nd Sentai, along with their Franks, would be going south. The Philippine campaign would expose the Frank's greatest weakness, not its design, which was fundamentally sound, but Japan's collapsing industrial and logistical situation. 7 Frank-equipped Sentai deployed to the Philippines by mid-October 1944. The 1st, 11th, 21st, 22nd, 51st, 52nd, 55th, 200th, and 246th Sentai brought approximately 200 Franks to counter the American invasion of Leyte. On paper, this was a formidable force. In reality, it was a house of cards. The Hamea engines arriving in the Philippines were increasingly unreliable. Manufacturing quality had deteriorated as American submarines strangled Japanese supply lines and B-29 bombers hammered factories. Landing gear failures multiplied. The poor heat treatment of high-strength steel meant struts collapsed on landing with alarming frequency. Fuel shortages meant limited training for new pilots, and the fuel that was available was lower octane than the Hamea was designed to use, reducing power output and reliability. The result was catastrophic. Aircraft that should have been capable of 390 miles per hour struggled to reach 360. Engines that should have been reliable failed after a few hours. Landing gear that should have supported the aircraft collapsed, destroying Franks on their home airfields. American submarine and air interdiction meant spare parts never arrived. Franks sat grounded for lack of a simple component, while American aircraft operated with full logistic support. And increasingly, the pilots flying the Franks were inadequately trained. Japan's pilot training program, never robust, was collapsing under the pressure of losses and fuel shortages. New pilots arrived at combat units with 100 hours of flight time or less. American pilots were arriving with 400 hours or more. The Americans over the Philippines weren't flying 51s and P-47s like in China. They were flying Navy F-6F Hellcats and F-4U Corsairs from carriers, plus P-38 Lightnings from land bases. In the hands of experienced American pilots, these were deadly opponents. The Hellcat in particular proved to be a nearly perfect counter to Japanese fighters. It was fast, well-armed, and incredibly rugged. Its 2,000 horsepower R-2800 engine was the same basic power plant used in the Corsair and Thunderbolt. But unlike those aircraft, which were designed as high-altitude performers, the Hellcat was optimized for the medium to low-altitude fights that characterized Pacific combat. In a well-maintained Frank with a good engine and an experienced pilot, the Japanese had a fighter that could match the Hellcat. The Frank could outturn it, matched its speed at medium altitudes, and had comparable firepower. But those conditions rarely existed. Most Franks were suffering from maintenance problems. Most pilots were inexperienced, and the Americans had numbers. For every Frank that got airborne, there were 5 or 10 American aircraft. The Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944 saw fierce air combat. Japanese fighters, including Franks, tried desperately to protect their fleet from American carrier aircraft. Some succeeded. Individual Frank pilots scored victories, but overwhelmingly the Americans dominated. By the 3rd week of November, the Japanese Army Air Force in the Philippines was down to 21% of its strength. The number fell further in December. By January 1945, the campaign was effectively over. The Japanese had lost hundreds of aircraft and pilots. The Americans had lost aircraft too, but they replaced them immediately. For Japan, the losses were permanent. On January 7, 1945, 4 Ci-38 Lightnings of the 431st Fighter Squadron prowled over Negros Island in the central Philippines. Their leader was Major Thomas Maguire, with 38 confirmed victories. He was the second highest scoring American ace, one behind Richard Bong's 40. Maguire desperately wanted to surpass his rival. Descending through clouds, Maguire's flight spotted a lone Japanese fighter near Manipla Airfield. It appeared to be a Ki-84 Oscar. Maguire ordered the attack. What happened next remains controversial to this day. The Oscar pilot, Warrant Officer Akira Sugimoto, was an instructor with thousands of hours of experience. He engaged the 4 P-38s with surprising aggression. The fight descended to low altitude. Lieutenant Douglas Throp, flying in the number 3 position, got into trouble. Sugimoto latched onto his tail. Maguire tried to help, attempting to draw the Japanese pilot off his wingman. He succeeded, but at a cost. At 300 feet altitude, Maguire pulled his P-38 into a tight turn while still carrying external fuel tanks. The combination of low altitude, extra weight, and violent manoeuvring was exactly what Maguire himself had warned against in training. His P-38 stalled, snap-rolled inverted, and dove into the ground. Maguire was killed instantly. Major Jack Rittmeyer shot down Sugimoto moments later, but the Oscar pilot survived the crash only to be killed by Filipino guerrillas. Then a Frank appeared. Technical Sergeant Mizunori Fukuda, flying from a nearby airstrip, attacked Rittmeyer head-on. The engagement was brief and violent. The Frank's firepower was devastating in a head-on pass. Rittmeyer survived, but barely. The death of Major Maguire, one of America's greatest aces, illustrated both the danger Japanese pilots still posed and the desperation of their situation. Sugimoto, an experienced instructor, had been flying what was likely one of Japan's oldest operational fighters. The Frank pilot who avenged him was probably as surprised to find American fighters over his airfield as the Americans were to encounter a Frank. As the Philippines fell, the Franks that survived were pulled back to Okinawa and the Japanese home islands. The final phase of the Franks' combat career would be fought over Japan itself. By April 1945, American forces were invading Okinawa. B-29's Superfortresses were systematically destroying Japanese cities. The end was approaching, and everyone knew it. The Frank units defending Japan faced an impossible situation. Fuel was desperately short. Spare parts were non-existent. Many aircraft couldn't reach the 30,000-foot altitude where B-29s operated. Production quality had deteriorated so badly that new Franks off the assembly line were essentially junk. On April 15, 1945, 11 Franks from the 100th Sentai launched a surprise strike against American airfields on Okinawa. Flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection, they reached the American positions at dawn. The Japanese pilots strafed parked aircraft, destroying or damaging a substantial number before American fighters could respond. It was a moment of tactical success in an ocean of strategic defeat. 8 of the 11 Franks were shot down. The 3 survivors returned to bases in Kyushu with damaged aircraft and wounded pilots. The Americans replaced their losses within days. For the Japanese, the 8 lost Franks and their pilots were irreplaceable. Post-war analysis revealed the Frank's true potential and the tragedy of its circumstance. In early 1946, American test pilots flew captured Franks that had been properly maintained and filled with high-octane fuel. The results shocked them. The Frank tested at the Middletown Air Depot in Pennsylvania outperformed or matched American fighters in most categories below 25,000 feet. It climbed faster than the P-51D Mustang. It outmaneuvered both the Mustang and P-47 Thunderbolt. Its top speed of 427 miles per hour with good fuel approached that of late-model Mustangs, and its cannon armament was devastating. Test pilot Walker Bud Mahurin, himself a combat ace with victories in both P-47s and F-6F Hellcats, flew a restored Frank in the late 1960s. His assessment was unequivocal. The Frank was one of the finest fighters of the war. With proper maintenance and fuel, it was competitive with anything the Allies flew. But those conditions rarely existed in combat. Charles Older, who had faced Franks over China, told interviewers in 2002 that he considered it the best Japanese fighter of the war and the most dangerous opponent he had encountered. Other American pilots who faced Franks echoed this assessment. The aircraft itself was excellent. The tragedy was Japan's inability to build and maintain it properly. The Nakajima Ha-45 Homar engine embodied Japan's dilemma. It was an advanced design that pushed Japanese engineering to its limits. With high-quality materials, skilled assembly, precision maintenance and high-octane fuel, it was a superb power plant. Without those things, it was a disaster. And as the war progressed, Japan had less and less of everything the Homar needed. American submarine warfare strangled raw material imports. Strategic bombing destroyed factories and disrupted production. Skilled workers were drafted into military service. The fuel Japan could produce was insufficient in both quantity and quality. The result was engines that varied wildly in performance. One Frank might have an engine that produced full-rated power and ran reliably. The next Frank off the same assembly line might have an engine that produced 20% less power and failed after 10 hours. Pilots never knew what they were getting. The Frank's similarity to earlier Nakajima fighters was both a blessing and a curse. From a distance, it resembled the Ki-83 Oscar and Ki-84 Tojo. This caused American pilots to misidentify it in early encounters, but it also meant Japanese pilots could transition to it relatively easily. The control feel was familiar. The handling characteristics, while more aggressive than the docile Oscar, weren't alien. New pilots with limited training could fly it safely, even if they couldn't exploit its full potential, but that similarity also cost lives. The Frank looked enough like an Oscar that American pilots sometimes treated it as one, closing to dogfight ranges where its superior firepower could be brought to bear. Several American pilots discovered too late that what they thought was an easy Oscar kill was actually a Frank. The Frank's combat debut over China in August 1944 represented its finest hour. The 22nd Sentai had experienced pilots, relatively good maintenance, access to decent fuel, and aircraft fresh from the factory. For 5 weeks they gave the Americans fits. But that situation was the exception, not the rule. Even in China, the Frank units faced challenges. The Amar engine required more maintenance than Japanese ground crews could provide. Landing gear failures destroyed aircraft, and American numerical superiority meant that tactical victories couldn't translate into strategic success. In the Philippines, Okinawa, and over the home islands, the situation deteriorated. By mid-1945, many Franks couldn't reach B-29 operating altitude. Those that could often had engines that failed in the thin air. The landing gear problem became endemic. Pilots returning from missions faced nearly as much danger landing as they had in combat. Yet individual Franks and their pilots continued to achieve remarkable results. A Frank with a good engine, proper maintenance, and an experienced pilot was deadly. American fighter pilots learned to respect the type. Intelligence reports warned that the Frank should be considered extremely dangerous. Tactics were developed specifically to counter it. Use your speed. Don't get into turning fights. Attack with altitude advantage. The same tactics Americans had been using against Japanese fighters for years, but now more urgent. The Frank could punish mistakes that might have been survivable against an Oscar or Zero. Some of the most poignant stories from the Frank's combat career come from the final months of the war. Pilots with hundreds of hours of experience flying their 10th or 20th mission, knowing they probably wouldn't survive the war. Ground crews working miracles to keep aircraft flying with no spare parts. Maintainers cannibalizing 5 broken Franks to make 1 operational aircraft. All of it in service of a cause that was clearly lost. The kamikaze campaign claimed relatively few Franks. The aircraft was considered too valuable for suicide missions. Better to save them for interception duties, where their performance might make a difference. But some Franks did fly kamikaze missions, their pilots diving their beautiful, capable fighters into American ships in a futile attempt to stop the inevitable. 79 Frank pilots from the Shinba Corps flew kamikaze missions from Myakunoja Army Air Base between April and July 1945. All were between 18 and 23 years old. All died. A memorial erected in Myakunoja City in 1977 remembers them. Their sacrifice changed nothing, but their courage was real. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, American technical teams fanned out across the home islands, examining Japanese aircraft and equipment. They found hundreds of Franks in various states of disrepair. Some were pristine examples fresh from underground factories. Most were war-weary machines held together with improvised repairs and sheer willpower. The Americans selected several Franks for detailed evaluation. 2 were tested by the Allied Technical Air Intelligence Unit in the Southwest Pacific area, designated S-10 and S-17. 2 more were shipped to the United States and designated FE-301 and FE-302, later changed to T-301 and T-302. The aircraft that would become most famous was serial number 1446, found at Clark Field in the Philippines in January 1945. Originally flown by the 11th Sentai, it had been abandoned when Japanese forces retreated. American intelligence officers claimed it, repaired it, and test flew it extensively. After the war, this Frank was shipped to the United States aboard the aircraft carrier USS Long Island. It eventually ended up at the Smithsonian Storage Facility at Park Ridge, Illinois. In the early 1950s, when the Air Force needed the facility, and the Smithsonian had to reduce its collection, several Japanese aircraft were declared surplus. Edward Maloney, a young aircraft collector from California, inquired about purchasing one. He was offered a choice, a Ki-84 Frank or a Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick heavy fighter. Maloney chose the Frank. Over the following years, his crew restored it to flying condition. Bud Mahurin, by then a colonel working for an aerospace company, supervised flight testing in the late 1960s. The restored Frank flew at airshows, drawing crowds who marvelled at its performance. In the 1970s, Japanese aviation enthusiasts arranged to bring the Frank back to Japan for appearances at airshows. The sight of the old warrior flying over Japanese skies again brought tears to veterans' eyes. Unfortunately, the Frank was left in Japan after its appearance tour. Stored outdoors, it deteriorated rapidly. By the time anyone thought to properly preserve it, the damage was done. The only surviving Ki-84 Frank, serial number 1446, now sits in the Chiron Peace Museum for kamikaze pilots in Kagoshima Prefecture. It can never fly again, but it stands as testament to what might have been. Total production of the Ki-84 reached 3514 aircraft between April 1944 and August 1945. This made it one of Japan's most produced fighters, trailing only the Zero and Oscar. At peak production in December 1944, Nakajima's factories completed 373 Franks. That same month, American factories produced over 2,000 fighters. The comparison illustrates Japan's impossible situation. The Americans were producing 7 fighters for everyone Japan built. And the American fighters came with spare parts, adequate maintenance support, and all the fuel they needed. If the Frank had appeared in 1942 instead of 1944, the Pacific War might have been different. Not in outcome, America's industrial advantage was too overwhelming, but in cost. A Frank in 1942 would have been a shock to American pilots accustomed to F-4F Wildcats and early P-40s. It would have been superior to everything the Allies had in the Pacific at that time. But by mid-1944, when the Frank entered service, the Americans had Hellcats, Corsairs, Thunderbolts, and Mustangs. The technological gap had narrowed. And more importantly, American pilots had years of combat experience and far better training than their Japanese counterparts. The decline in Japanese pilot quality was perhaps more significant than any aircraft's performance. In 1942, Japanese naval and army pilots were among the best in the world, with hundreds or thousands of hours of training. By 1945, new Japanese pilots arrived at combat units with minimal training, facing American pilots who had received comprehensive instruction and hundreds of flying hours. You could give a poorly trained pilot the best fighter in the world, and he'd still lose to an experienced pilot in an inferior aircraft. The Frank gave Japanese pilots a fighting chance. In the hands of a skilled pilot, it was competitive with American fighters at the altitudes where most Pacific combat occurred. But skilled pilots were increasingly rare. Many had died in earlier campaigns. Training programs couldn't replace them fast enough. Those who survived were spread thin, trying to pass on their knowledge to new pilots who had barely learned to take off and land. American intelligence assessments of the Frank evolved throughout the war. Initial reports from China in August 1944 noted a new Japanese fighter that was faster and more heavily armed than previous types. By October, after Franks appeared in the Philippines, the reports became more urgent. This was a dangerous aircraft that should be treated with respect. By early 1945, intelligence officers were telling pilots that the Frank was probably the best Japanese fighter they'd encounter. Post-war evaluation reports concluded that a well-maintained Frank with good fuel was competitive with late-war American fighters in most performance categories below 25,000 feet. One assessment noted that it outclimbed and outmaneuvered the P-51H Mustang and P-47N Thunderbolt, the ultimate developments of those types, when tested with high-octane fuel. But these assessments always included a crucial caveat. The Frank encountered in combat rarely performed to its design potential. Poor fuel, inadequate maintenance, and manufacturing defects meant most operational Franks were significantly slower and less reliable than test examples. German pilots facing American fighters in Europe reported similar frustrations. Their jets were faster than anything the Allies had, but fuel shortages and lack of spare parts meant most jets sat grounded. When they did fly, Many were flown by pilots with minimal jet training. Superior technology couldn't compensate for collapsing logistics and infrastructure. The Frank shared this fate. Scattered throughout the Pacific are memorials and crash sites related to the Ki-84. On Negros Island, where Major Thomas Maguire died, a memorial marks the spot where America's second highest scoring ace fell. The memorial doesn't mention the Frank pilot who appeared afterward, but local historians have pieced together that story. In China, former airfields where the 22nd Sentai operated have largely been reclaimed by time. But local residents still remember the summer of 1944, when Japanese fighters once again contested the skies, and American pilots suddenly had to be very careful. In Japan itself, the underground factories where desperate workers tried to maintain Frank production in the war's final months still exist. Some are tourist attractions now, sobering reminders of Total War's demands. Among the ironies of the Frank story is that it vindicated every criticism of pre-war Japanese fighter design. Those critics had argued for heavier armament, armor protection, and self-sealing fuel tanks. They'd been overruled by a doctrine that prioritized offensive capability and maneuverability above all else. The Zero's success in the war's opening phase seemed to prove the doctrine correct. But as the war progressed, the wisdom of the critics became apparent. Maneuverability and long range were useless if the pilot died from a single hit. Lightweight was pointless if the aircraft caught fire from machine gun rounds. The Frank incorporated everything the critics had wanted. It had armor and self-sealing tanks. It had heavy firepower. It was faster and more robust than earlier Japanese fighters, and it was still maneuverable enough to dogfight successfully. But by the time it arrived, Japan lacked the resources to build it properly and the trained pilots to fly it effectively. The Frank story is ultimately a tragedy. Not of design, the aircraft was excellent, but of timing and circumstance. It arrived too late to change anything. It was built under conditions that prevented it from achieving its potential. And it was flown by pilots who often lack the training to survive, let alone prevail. Those American pilots who faced the Frank and survived speak of it with respect. They knew they'd encountered something dangerous. The ones who didn't survive, those who underestimated it or got careless, paid the ultimate price. Japanese pilots who flew the Frank remember it fondly. It gave them a fighting chance when everything else was hopeless. It was powerful, responsive, and capable. On a good day, with a good engine and decent fuel, a Frank pilot could take on American fighters with confidence. Those good days became increasingly rare. As the Frank program wound down in summer 1945, Japanese engineers were already working on improved versions, the Ki-84N and Ki-84P variants with larger wings and better high-altitude performance, the Ki-117 with an even more powerful engine. None of these reached production before the surrender. Even if they had, it wouldn't have mattered. By mid-1945, Japan's situation was hopeless. No fighter, however capable, could stop the American bombing campaign or prevent the invasion that was coming. The Frank's combat career lasted barely a year, from August 1944 to August 1945. In that year, it fought over China, the Philippines, Okinawa, and the Japanese home islands. It faced the best fighters America could field, and proved itself their equal in many respects. But individual excellence couldn't overcome systemic collapse. Japanese industry couldn't match American production. Japanese training programs couldn't replace pilot losses. Japanese logistics couldn't keep aircraft supplied and maintained. The Frank was a superb fighter caught in an impossible situation. There's a photograph taken at Middletown Air Depot in Pennsylvania in early 1946. It shows several American test pilots standing beside a captured Frank. The aircraft gleams in the sunlight, its engine cowling polished, propeller blades straight. It looks deadly and purposeful, exactly what it was designed to be. One of the pilots in the photo is smiling. He'd just test-flown the Frank and been impressed by its performance. His report would conclude that American pilots were fortunate the Frank hadn't appeared earlier in the war and hadn't been available in better condition when it did appear. That pilot understood what pilots on both sides had learned. The Frank was one of the finest fighters of World War II. It combined performance, firepower, and handling in a package that was competitive with anything in the sky. But it arrived too late, built too poorly, and flown by pilots who were too inexperienced. August 22nd, 1944. The day Captain Robert Peterson and his fellow American pilots encountered the Frank for the first time over Hankow. They'd gone into that fight confident, expecting to face the same overmatched Japanese fighters they'd been defeating for months. They came out of it shaken, having discovered that Japan still had surprises up its sleeve. Over the next 12 months, thousands of American pilots would learn the same lesson. The Frank was dangerous. Respect it or die. For Japanese pilots, the Frank represented both hope and despair. Hope because finally they had an aircraft that could match the Americans. Despair because even with this capable fighter, they were still losing. One pilot, interviewed decades after the war, summed it up perfectly. The Ki-84 was everything we needed. Fast, strong, well-armed. If we'd had it in 1942, who knows? But in 1944, with no fuel, no parts, and barely trained pilots, even the best fighter in the world couldn't save us. We flew it knowing we were probably going to die, but at least we'd die in something worthy of our training and our sacrifice. The Frank gave us back our pride, even if it couldn't give us victory. That's the legacy of the Ki-84 Frank, a superb fighter that arrived too late to matter strategically, but proved that Japanese engineers could design world-class aircraft when given the resources and time. A capable weapon undermined by industrial collapse and pilot attrition. A fighter that shocked American pilots when they first encountered it but couldn't change the war's outcome. The thunder over the Pacific in 1944 and 1945 included the roar of Pratt & Whitney radials in American fighters and the howl of Nakajima Homare engines in Franks. The Americans had numbers, logistics, and well-trained pilots. The Japanese had courage, determination, and in the Frank, finally, an excellent aircraft. It wasn't enough. When the guns fell silent in August 1945, the last flyable Franks were scrapped or captured. Most were turned into scrap metal to rebuild Japan. A few survived in museums. Only one exists today, grounded forever, silent testimony to what might have been if the circumstances had been different. American pilots who faced it remember the Frank as the most dangerous Japanese fighter they encountered. Japanese pilots who flew it remember it as their best chance in a war that was already lost. Both sides agree on one thing. The Ki-84 Frank was a hell of an airplane. The Frank's technical specifications tell only part of the story. On paper, it was impressive. Wingspan of 36 feet 10 inches, length of 32 feet 6 inches, wing area of 226 square feet, empty weight of 5,864 pounds, loaded weight of 7,965 pounds, maximum takeoff weight of 8,876 pounds with drop tanks. These numbers put it in the same class as American fighters like the P-47 Thunderbolt and F-6F Hellcat. But numbers don't convey what it was like to fly. Japanese pilots who transitioned to the Frank from earlier fighters described the experience as revelatory. The power was the first thing they noticed. Push the throttle forward on takeoff, and the Hamar's 2,000 horsepower slammed you back in the seat. The acceleration was unlike anything in previous Japanese fighters. The Oscar had been docile, almost gentle. The Frank was aggressive, demanding attention and respect. The cockpit was cramped by American standards, but spacious compared to the Zero or Oscar. The pilot sat high, giving excellent visibility through the bubble canopy. The instrument panel was logically arranged, though lacking the sophistication of American designs. No gyroscopic instruments, no artificial horizon. Japanese pilots navigated and fought by visual reference, a technique that worked well in the clear Pacific skies, but proved problematic in bad weather or at night. The control stick was heavier than earlier Japanese fighters, reflecting the Frank's higher wing loading and speed. At low speeds, it required muscle. But as speed increased, the controls became beautifully harmonized. Roll rate was excellent throughout the speed range. The Frank could snap into a turn with authority, yet it didn't have the hair trigger sensitivity that made some fighters dangerous for inexperienced pilots. Ground handling was the Frank's most challenging characteristic. The narrow track landing gear, a compromise to fit within the wing structure, made takeoff and landing exciting. Crosswinds required careful attention. The torque from that massive propeller wanted to pull the nose left on takeoff. Pilots learned to anticipate it, feeding in right rudder as they advanced the throttle. Get it wrong and you'd ground loop, possibly collapsing the already problematic landing gear. But once airborne, the Frank transformed. Lieutenant Naoki Ogata, who flew Franks with the 47th Sentai, described his first flight in an interview recorded in 1987. "The moment the wheels left the ground, I fell in love. The climb was spectacular. We'd been flying Ki-43s and they climbed well but slowly. The Frank climbed like it was angry, just clawing its way up, and the acceleration. In the Oscar, you pushed the throttle forward and eventually you went faster. In the Frank, you pushed the throttle and you went faster right now." Combat maneuvers revealed the Frank's true character. It wasn't as light and nimble as the Oscar in slow-speed turning fights. Physics wouldn't allow it. The Frank weighed 2,000 pounds more. But in the altitude band between 10,000 and 20,000 feet, where most Pacific combat occurred, it combined sufficient maneuverability with speed and firepower that made it deadly. The Frank's best tactic against American fighters was the vertical fight. Its power-to-weight ratio and clean aerodynamics gave it an excellent climb rate. A Frank pilot being pursued could pull up into a steep climb, using his superior climbing ability to gain separation and reverse the engagement. American pilots quickly learned not to follow a Frank up unless they had a substantial energy advantage. In turning fights, the Frank's performance depended heavily on altitude and speed. At low altitude and high speed, it turned respectably but not spectacularly. The high wing loading meant it bled energy in sustained turns, but Japanese pilots were trained in energy management. They didn't try to outturn American fighters in sustained horizontal turns. Instead, they used vertical maneuvers, scissors, and slashing attacks that played to the Frank's strengths. The armament was a revelation for Japanese pilots accustomed to rifle-caliber machine guns. The 205 20mm cannon in the wings had a muzzle velocity of 750 meters per second and fired a 100-gram explosive shell. When those shells hit, they didn't puncture, they detonated. Aluminum skin peeled back, structural members shattered, control cables severed. The two 12.7mm Ho 103 machine guns in the nose cowling, synchronized to fire through the propeller arc, supplemented the cannon. These were based on the Browning M2 design, license built in Japan with some modifications. Each gun fired at about 900 rounds per minute. The tracers helped with aiming, and the bullets provided additional hitting power. Japanese pilots were trained to hold fire until close range, typically inside 200 meters. At that distance, the Frank's armament was devastating. A 1-second burst put 6 20-meton shells and 30 12.7mm bullets into the target area. Few aircraft could survive that kind of punishment. But ammunition capacity was limited. The 150 rounds per cannon provided only about 8 seconds of firing time. The 350 rounds per machine gun gave about 23 seconds. Pilots learned to fire in short bursts, making every shot count. Spray-and-pray tactics would leave you defenseless after one engagement. The gun sight was a Type 3, a simple reflector sight similar to those used in most World War II fighters. It projected an illuminated reticle onto a glass plate in front of the pilot. Adjust the brightness with a rheostat, estimate the target's range and size, and put the aiming point on the enemy. Simple and effective in the hands of a trained pilot. Fire discipline separated experienced Frank pilots from novices. Veterans knew to close to knife-fighting range before firing. They knew to lead the target properly, accounting for deflection and gravity drop. They knew to fire in controlled bursts, watching the tracers walk onto the target before giving it a sustained burst. New pilots, desperate and poorly trained, often opened fire at 400 or 500 meters, wasting ammunition on shots that had no chance of hitting. By the time they closed to effective range, their guns were empty. American pilots quickly learned to distinguish between experienced and inexperienced Japanese pilots based on their gunnery. If tracers started coming at long range, the enemy was probably green. If nothing happened until he was dangerously close, you were fighting a veteran. The Frank's defensive characteristics were equally important. The armor protection that had been revolutionary in Japanese fighters proved its worth in combat. The 13mm armor plate behind the pilot's seat could stop rifle-caliber rounds and sometimes even 50-caliber bullets at longer ranges. The 70mm armored glass windscreen provided frontal protection without significantly compromising visibility. Self-sealing fuel tanks were a massive improvement over earlier Japanese fighters. The rubber lining would swell when punctured by bullets, sealing small holes and preventing fuel leakage. It wasn't perfect. Large holes or concentrated fire would overwhelm the self-sealing capability, but it gave pilots a fighting chance to survive hits and return home. The Frank's radial engine was both an advantage and a disadvantage defensively. The air-cooled HIMAR had no vulnerable coolant system. Liquid-cooled engines like those in the P-51 Mustang or British Spitfire could be disabled by a single hit that punctured the coolant lines. The engine would overheat and seize within minutes. The Frank's radial could take multiple hits to individual cylinders and keep running, albeit with reduced power. But the radial engine also presented a larger frontal area, making it an easier target in head-on engagements, and while it could survive losing a few cylinders, catastrophic damage to the crankcase or crankshaft would bring it down just as surely as a coolant hit would kill a liquid-cooled engine. Pilot accounts from both sides describe the eerie experience of scoring hits on a Frank without bringing it down. American pilots accustomed to Zeros that caught fire, or Oscars that broke apart from a few hits found themselves pumping round after round into Franks that kept flying. The robust construction and protective features made it a survivor. But survival had its limits. Once damaged, a Frank faced the same challenge as any single-engine fighter: getting home on a crippled aircraft, possibly leaking fuel, possibly with battle damage to flight controls, and certainly knowing that if the engine quit, you were either bailing out or crash landing in hostile territory. The psychological impact of flying the Frank varied by circumstance. For the experienced pilots of the 22nd Sentai in China in August 1944, the Frank restored confidence. Finally, they had an aircraft that didn't require them to fight with one hand tied behind their back. They could engage American fighters without accepting that they were probably going to die. The Frank gave them a chance. For the poorly trained pilots who received Franks in the Philippines and later, the aircraft was almost intimidating. They knew it was capable, but they lacked the skills to exploit that capability. It was like giving a racing car to someone who'd barely learned to drive. The potential was there, but the pilot couldn't access it. And for the pilots who flew Franks in the war's final months over Japan, the aircraft represented bitter irony. Here was the fighter they'd needed 2 years ago, finally available in numbers but crippled by lack of fuel, spare parts and maintenance. They'd sit in the cockpit of this beautiful, capable machine, knowing that today's mission would probably be their last. Not because the Frank wasn't good enough, but because they were outnumbered 50-1 and flying on fumes. The maintenance perspective on the Frank reveals another dimension of its story. Ground crews loved and hated it in equal measure. They loved it because when properly maintained with quality parts and adequate resources, the Frank was reliable and capable. They hated it because those conditions rarely existed. The HIMAR engine was the primary source of both pride and frustration. When everything was right, good fuel, quality lubricants, proper maintenance schedules, adequate spare parts, the engine was a marvel. It produced tremendous power and ran smoothly. Mechanics took pride in keeping their engines in top condition. But as the war progressed and conditions deteriorated, the HIMAR became a nightmare. The tight tolerances that gave it good performance also made it sensitive to poor quality fuel and inadequate maintenance. The high compression ratios required high-octane fuel. Feed it low-octane fuel and it would knock, losing power and suffering potential damage. The complex valve train required precise adjustment. Get the valve clearances wrong, and the engine would lose power or suffer valve failures. But proper adjustment required tools and skills that were increasingly scarce. Mechanics found themselves making do with improvised tools and inadequate training. Oil leaks were endemic. The numerous joints and seals in the engine provided plenty of opportunities for leaks to develop. In peacetime, with proper gaskets and seals, this would be manageable. In wartime, with substitute materials, it was a constant battle. Mechanics would arrive in the morning to find pools of oil under their aircraft, knowing they'd spend the day tracing and fixing leaks instead of performing more critical maintenance. The landing gear problems stemmed from material shortages and quality control issues. The heat treatment of the high-strength steel components required precise temperature control and proper quenching. As Japan's industrial situation deteriorated, quality control slipped. Some landing gear struts were properly heat-treated and performed fine. Others were inadequately treated and failed under normal loads. Ground crews couldn't tell by looking which struts were good and which were faulty. They'd service an aircraft, watch it take off and complete a successful mission, and then watch in horror as the landing gear collapsed on landing. Pilots who'd survived combat with American fighters were injured or killed in landing accidents. Aircraft that should have been quickly repaired and returned to service were instead written off due to landing gear collapse. Cannibalization became standard practice. A Sentai might have 30 Franks on its roster, but only 15 flyable at any given time. The other 15 were hangar queens, aircraft grounded for lack of a critical part. Need a replacement fuel pump? Pull one from a grounded aircraft. Need spark plugs? Cannibalize them from another Frank. It was a death spiral. Each aircraft you cannibalized had one less source of spare parts for the future. Mechanics worked miracles with inadequate resources. They fabricated parts that should have come from factories. They improvised repairs that would have horrified peacetime inspectors but kept aircraft flying for one more mission. They jury-rigged solutions to problems that should have been fixed with proper parts but couldn't be, because those parts didn't exist. One maintenance sergeant interviewed in the 1990s described the situation in the Philippines in late 1944. We had maybe 20 Franks, but on a good day we could get 12 airborne. The rest were waiting for parts that were never going to arrive. We'd work through the night, pulling parts from one aircraft to get another flying. The pilots would take off at dawn and we'd pray they'd come back. Not just because we cared about them, we did, but because every aircraft that didn't come back was one less source of spare parts. The fuel situation compounded every other problem. The Hamao was designed for 92-octane fuel. Later specifications called for 100-octane. What Japanese units actually received varied wildly. Sometimes they'd get 87-octane fuel, which caused the engine to knock and lose power. Sometimes they'd get fuel contaminated with water or dirt, which could cause engine failures. Fuel quality testing was difficult with limited resources. Ground crews developed rules of thumb. If the fuel smelled wrong or looked cloudy, it was probably contaminated. If the engine knocked on run-up, the fuel was probably too low octane. But often they had no choice. Fly with bad fuel or don't fly at all. The Americans, meanwhile, had fuel in abundance. High-octane fuel was shipped to forward bases in quantity. American fighters flew with fuel that met or exceeded specifications. American engines ran at their rated power, producing the performance their designers intended. This disparity in logistics extended to every aspect of operations. American units received regular shipments of spare parts. Japanese units made do. American pilots flew aircraft that were properly maintained. Japanese pilots flew aircraft that were held together with improvised repairs. American mechanics had proper tools and adequate supplies. Japanese mechanics improvised with whatever they could find. The Frank's combat record must be understood in this context. When you read that a Frank was shot down, consider that it might have been flying on bad fuel, with an engine that wasn't producing full power, flown by a pilot with minimal training, and maintained by ground crews working miracles just to get it airborne. That it flew at all was testament to the dedication of everyone involved. Conversely, when you read about a Frank achieving victory, recognize what that meant. Despite all the disadvantages, despite the impossible odds, that pilot and aircraft succeeded. Those victories were hard won against opponents who had every advantage. The tactical evolution of Frank operations reflected the changing circumstances. In China in August 1944, the 22nd Sentai flew offensive missions. They escorted bombers, conducted fighter sweeps, strafed airfields, and engaged American fighters on relatively equal terms. Major Iwahashi developed tactics that exploited the Frank's strengths: aggressive climbing attacks, slashing runs that used superior speed at medium altitude, and vertical maneuvers that played to the Frank's power. These tactics worked because the 22nd Sentai had the resources to execute them. Aircraft were relatively well maintained. Pilots were experienced. Fuel was adequate, if not abundant. The Sentai could plan missions knowing most of their aircraft would be flyable. By the time Frank units deployed to the Philippines 3 months later, circumstances had changed drastically. Offensive operations gave way to desperate defense. Frank scrambled to intercept American bomber formations, knowing they'd be vastly outnumbered. They flew defensive patrols trying to protect airfields from American strafing attacks. They conducted hasty strikes against American positions, often with inadequate planning because there wasn't time for proper preparation. The tactics reflected this desperation. Rather than planned, coordinated attacks, Frank operations in the Philippines often consisted of throwing whatever aircraft could get airborne at American formations. Sometimes this meant a single Chutai of 4 to 6 aircraft, attacking formations of 30 or 40 American fighters and bombers. The odds were impossible, but what else could they do? Individual initiative became increasingly important as command and control broke down. Squadron leaders couldn't maintain formation cohesion when half their aircraft were struggling with engine problems or running on fumes. Flights broke up into individual combat, each pilot fighting his own battle. The Franks' capabilities gave skilled pilots a chance in these individual engagements, but tactical coordination fell apart. By the defense of Okinawa and the home islands in 1945, Frank operations had evolved again. Now they were conducting interception missions against B-29 formations at altitudes where the Franks struggled to perform. They were flying from dispersed, hidden airfields to avoid American strafing attacks. They were rationing fuel so carefully that pilots had barely enough to reach the engagement area, fight briefly, and return, assuming nothing went wrong. Some units developed innovative tactics out of desperation. High-speed diving attacks on American bomber formations, trying to get through the defensive fire, make one pass, and escape before escort fighters could react. It was dangerous and had limited effectiveness, but it was better than trying to engage in sustained combat where American numbers would overwhelm them. Others reverted to tactics that seemed suicidal, deliberate ramming attacks on American bombers when ammunition ran out. Not formal kamikaze missions, but individual decisions by pilots who figured that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well take an American bomber with them. The psychological toll on Frank pilots in this final phase was immense. They knew the war was lost. They knew that each mission might be their last. They knew that their sacrifice would change nothing strategically, yet they flew anyway, because that's what duty required. That's what their training and culture demanded. Some found meaning in protecting their homeland. Every American bomber they shot down was one less bombing Japanese cities. Every mission they flew might save civilian lives below. Whether this was true or merely rationalization didn't matter. It gave them purpose. Others flew simply because they were pilots, and this was what pilots did. The Frank gave them an aircraft worthy of their training. If they had to die, at least they'd die flying something good, fighting as well as circumstances allowed. And some few, the rarest and most remarkable, maintained genuine hope. Maybe they'd survive. Maybe the war would end with some kind of negotiated settlement. Maybe their skills and their Frank would get them through one more mission, and then one more after that. The bond between Frank pilots and their ground crews deepened as conditions worsened. Pilots knew that every time they returned, they were bringing back an aircraft that mechanics would work miracles to make flyable again. Ground crews knew that every time they launched an aircraft, they might be sending a pilot to his death. This shared understanding created relationships that lasted decades after the war. One pilot, writing in his memoirs 40 years later, described returning from a mission with his Frank shot full of holes, one cylinder completely destroyed and fuel leaking from multiple punctures in the self-sealing tanks. I somehow got it on the ground. The landing gear held, thank God. I shut down the engine and just sat there shaking. My crew chief climbed up on the wing, looked at the damage, and started crying. Not because the aircraft was so badly damaged, but because I'd made it back. He told me later he'd been certain I was dead. They worked for 3 days straight to repair that aircraft. 3 days later I flew it again. That's what we all did. We kept flying because they kept fixing.